Taoiseach Simon Harris, good morning.
Good morning, Shane.
Thank you indeed for coming in to us. Can we start with the lead story in the Irish Times today? Stark risk to economy detailed at Cabinet. The Cabinet being warned yesterday about potentially damaging economic fallout for Ireland from the unsettled global situation and the return of Donald Trump to the White House. But if you were to read your election manifesto and the promises you've been making, you guys are partying like there is no tomorrow.
So firstly, I brought that memo to Cabinet yesterday because I've had a number of engagements internationally in the last couple of weeks about how the world must prepare for the policy shift that we will now see in the United States. I met with European leaders in Budapest. Indeed, I spoke to President-elect Donald Trump last week as well. And I thought it was really appropriate that I would update the Cabinet so the incoming government can be prepared, whoever's in it, that Ireland now needs to prepare for a reality that there may well be a transatlantic trade shock. And I'm pleased to say that work is now underway in government departments and indeed at an EU level. EU and the US depend on each other. Of course they do. They did before the presidential election. They will after the presidential election. But there is a new reality now in terms of the policy approach. And that is why it is absolutely essential that in this election and the next government prepares for those shocks by putting in place a buffer, by putting in place funds that can protect us from any changes in our economy or the European economy that might come. Now, you made an assertion about our manifesto. I would point out we are the only political party.
Oh, you're not alone. All the political parties are doing it.
Yeah, that was the point I was going to make. We are the only political party in this election who is keeping within the 5% spending rule outlined by the Department of Finance. We're spending significant...
A rule you haven't kept to at all since you were in government, since that rule was brought in.
So good reasons in relation to that around COVID and around inflation. But we do now need to get back to a point of 5% spending. And my party has outlined what that means. And quite frankly, it means about 27 billion less being spent and committed to by my party than Sinn Féin. We are, though, going to see a very significant increase in capital spending. So what we're doing is we're using the Department of Finance figures in terms of how we can increase current spending. And we're also then using the Apple money to invest significantly in infrastructure. I should say to your listeners this, though. While there are significant headwinds, of course there are, and I was right, I think, to inform Cabinet of this yesterday, our country is in a good shape to withstand it, but only if we continue the policy direction in terms of setting aside money in funds to protect us from any future shocks.
It's not just capital spending. I mean, capital spending is fine, but you're topping up the Help to Buy scheme, you're increasing the old age pension by a third. These are all promises. You're abolishing university fees, double payments for child benefit in August, cheap childcare, abolishing the means test for carers, and then you have that acorn scheme for newborn babies. I mean, all of those might be very welcome and very attractive for voters. But you're spending, again, like there is no tomorrow. And the Fiscal Council say that you're being reckless. Not directly Fine Gael, but the government is being reckless and you're in danger of repeating the mistakes of the past.
So I'm sure you'll accept the reality that my party is making fewer commitments in relation to additional current spending than all other major parties. Statement of fact. Second point is we're doing this whilst also setting aside money for the future. So my party is committing to putting aside future funds, basically the state's piggy bank of €50 billion, and we'll get that fund to €50 billion over the lifetime of the next government. That's exactly the buffer to make sure my children never experience the austerity that our generation did. But at the same time, a lot of those things that
50 billion would have got us about 3 years during the last crisis. I think actually it wouldn't even. We had a 20 billion hole in the public finances overnight during the last crash. And that 50 billion could vanish very quickly.
Well, I think two things. I think firstly, you'll acknowledge that many parties aren't committing to setting that amount aside. And I think the second thing is I think the economy is in a very different place structurally than it was at the time of the Celtic Tiger, because we have, I think, been running an economy that is much more stable. But I have to say this too. I mean, I'm travelling right across the country. I've been in 31, 32 constituencies over the last, 12, 13 days. I'm hearing from people right across the country about the cost of living, and that's real too. And a number of the decisions that we're making in our manifesto are about actually investment. So, for example, we are making spending commitments around lowering the VAT rate for small businesses, about giving small businesses a PRSI rebate. We're doing that to save jobs. We're doing that to recognise that there's hundreds of thousands of people in their cars this morning going to work in foreign direct investment companies. We need to keep that investment there. We can't take that for granted. But also, for every 3 jobs in Ireland, 2 out of those 3 jobs are in small Indigenous Irish companies. We have to support them. You referenced childcare. Yes, we're committing to spending a lot on childcare, but that's an investment in our future for so many levels, including in our workforce. I mean, families are facing bills when it comes to childcare that can be like a second mortgage. So I believe my party, Fine Gael, has a balanced approach to this. Yes, increasing public spending, only doing it in line with the Department of Finance, but also setting aside money for any future economic shocks we or the EU might experience.
You accuse Sinn Féin of being reckless with the coffers. By the way, they say your Fine Gael are lying in relation to them raiding the piggy bank. We might get back to that in a second. But can I ask you about this acorn scheme? Because people who work in areas with children who are impoverished say you're widening inequality due to the design. They say if you can afford to add €2,000 every year under this scheme, a child will have 53,000 at the age of 18. But if, like many families, you can't afford to do that, the child will be left with €3,000 at the age of 18. It's basically a blatant subsidy for the middle classes, isn't it?
So firstly, it shouldn't be read as the totality of what we're trying to do on child poverty or
I
well-being.
wasn't. No, I wasn't.
I know you're not,
suggesting it was.
but I heard that in the leaders' debate the other night. People rightly pointing out that there's too many children living in child poverty, and there's a number of measures I want to take, including a second-tier child benefit payment to lift children out of child poverty. I feel passionate about that. But on this scheme, I also feel strongly on this too. We have to create a culture in Ireland where we can prepare and plan for the future, just like you're asking me about the government planning for shocks. And by setting up a savings account for the very first time in the history of the state, the government will be giving every child at birth a savings account, putting money in it, putting more money in it for children from a disadvantaged background. There's nothing to stop future governments, and indeed if I was in one I'd like to do this, topping up those accounts when the country is going well, if the country is going well.
It's a bang of SSIAs off it, Minister. The Charlie McCreevy
There are some similarities, but actually it's I think it's a very intelligent thing to do from an economic point of view, because actually what it's doing is not just supporting our children when they reach adulthood in terms of costs they may face, it's also helping create that saving culture and making sure there's a saving fund that effectively be spent in the economy in a number of years' time. It's also, though, let's be honest, I don't know many people who are going to put £2,000 in this savings account. There's a cost of living crisis going on, but I know a lot of people who set aside a tenner or 20 quid or put a few bob in at Christmas or birthdays or from the grandparents or whatever they can, and giving people that structure where the government will get you around 4% interest, I think is a clever thing to do, and I've met a lot of parents who really support it.
Just finally on the threat that Donald Trump poses, people who advise multinationals have been privately briefing journalists about a bizarre complacency at the heart of government in relation to this. Are you being complacent about what the dangers are here?
No, I'm not. And I mean, that's why I've spoken to President-elect Trump. It's why I went to Budapest, even though we're about to dissolve the Dáil, to meet with the European Commission and presidents and prime ministers from across Europe. It's why we're setting aside money. But let me say this. It's also why we have to spend some money. It's also why we have to use the Apple proceeds to invest in infrastructure. Because, Shane, when I meet American multinationals, when I meet businesses in general investing in this country, and they talk about future investments they may or may not make, they talk about things like water, they talk about things like energy, housing, our general transport infrastructure. And we're going to use the totality of that €14 billion from Apple to invest in those key areas. Nobody owes this country a living. And there are too many parties in this election who are complacent about our economic well-being. And it's been very interesting. Nearly all of the debates in this election have been about how would you actually spend the money. What I'm saying very clearly as Taoiseach of this country is our economy is in good stead. We are ready for any shocks that may come. But we do need a real focus on competitiveness. We need a real focus on working intensively at an EU level. And we've got to continue to put aside additional resources when we have them to buffer us from any shocks. That is essential.
You've been accused of using your Instagram account to make multiple promises. I think one political correspondent, well-respected political correspondent, said on Saturday someone should take Simon Harris's phone away before he bankrupts the country. Is that the way to run the country?
Well, firstly, I'm not sure if you have a problem with me talking on Instagram to people, but I think it's important that we update people on many, many platforms. And in this election, I think it's important we get our messages out to everybody. But let me come back to a point that I'm not going to allow be glossed over. All of the manifestos are out there now. You can look at, I have a sheet of paper here for you now. You can look at the spending plans of all of the parties. Please do that. And then please absolutely be clear and let the listeners be clear that my party is the only party keeping within the 5% spending rule. My party is continuing to set aside money for those difficult times that may well come. And there are many other parties committing to spending a lot more money that, quite frankly, I don't believe this country may have. So making commitments around that money is irresponsible in the extreme.
Okay, can I ask you about a few other issues? Another story in the Irish Times today about your Finance Minister, Pascal Donoghue, having a private undisclosed dinner with the Ryanair chief. Your reaction to this story?
There's very clear rules around business engagements, and those rules are always followed. My understanding is this was entirely a social dinner, and therefore I don't have any further comment in relation to it. We don't regulate who you have dinner with in this country, but we do put very clear rules in relation to lobbying and the likes, and this was not that.
Okay. Can I ask you about another one of your ministers, Justice Minister Helen McEntee, your deputy leader of your party? Do you believe some of the criticism of Helen McEntee has been sexist in nature?
I think Cathy Sheridan in the Irish Times yesterday, and indeed I think Ellen Coyne in the Irish Independent in recent days, I think made very fair points. I think some of the comments have been, I think some of the comments have been, you know, a bit inappropriate, quite frankly. I mean, Helen McEntee, um,
Including from Fianna Fáil, or particularly from Fianna
I'm
Fáil?
not getting into this reopening tit for tat stuff, but I do think people need to. I do think some of people need to check some of the language that they had used in recent days in relation to in relation to some of the criticisms.
You think it is sexist?
I think there's an undertone there at times, and I think it's not just confined to Minister McEntee, but also to many women in politics. And I think we need to be aware of that, and I think we need to call that out. But let me say this: Helen McEntee, as the deputy leader of Fine Gael, myself as a leader of Fine Gael, we're contesting this election on our record. And if you look at things like the issues that she's highlighted, domestic, sexual, gender-based violence, name me a justice minister ever in the history of the state who placed a greater focus on that issue. When you look at things like migration and the changes in policies that we've brought about in relation to faster processing times, deportations, making sure we have a fair, firm system, her record speaks for itself, and I'm very proud of the work she does.
Okay, can I ask you about John McGahon, your candidate who's under pressure in County Louth? Look, we know your view. You're standing by the centre. Can I just ask you one question on that? If you had seen the video that is now circulating, if you had seen that 6 months ago or 12 months ago, would you have made a different decision about selecting Senator McGahon as a candidate?
No, if I'd seen it, I certainly wouldn't have described it as a scuffle. But I do think we just need to be very careful here. The way we decide on assault in this country is by judge and jury. And you may have seen, and I may have seen, some CCTV footage. And let me be clear, I abhor violence, absolutely abhor it. I don't in any way, shape, or form defend at all what happened there. But I do know this: 12 men and women on a jury and a judge sat down and looked at all of the evidence, looked at all of the CCTV, all of the photographs, heard from Gardaí, heard from witnesses, heard the self-defence argument put forward by the now senator, and they acquitted him. They found him not guilty. I think that has to count for something.
Okay, so it's the court, not the video, that's the relevant thing you're saying here.
I think so. I mean, due process matters in this country.
Okay.
You have a right. You have a right. You must answer for allegations, and then you also have a right to put a defence forward. And then a jury decides, and the jury was clear. He was rightly punished in terms of a financial penalty in a civil court. That's an appropriate thing. This should not have happened. But we also look at people in the round in life. He's worked very hard in Louth, and it's now up to the people of Louth to decide.
Were you right on Monday night to correct Katie Hannon when she said you signed off on the children's hospital?
No, I think I was unnecessarily pedantic and semantic, and I shouldn't. I mean, look, the book stops with me in relation to the National Children's Hospital. Let me be very clear in relation to that. I suppose the point I was trying to make is this: you know, there's sometimes comments that are a little flippant, like one person signed off on the contract. The point I'm making is these things go through a very deliberative process. Lots of departments look at them, lots of bean counters, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, in different departments look at it. Agencies look, there's a board, a National Paediatric Hospital Development Board, and then the minister of the day, in this case was me, would bring a proposal to Cabinet rather than sign a contract. That kind of missed the point, though. But can I say on the National Children's Hospital, because my political opponents talk about it a lot, the National Children's Hospital is expensive. It is too expensive. It's cost much more than it should have. However, it's about the equivalent of 6 months of the pandemic unemployment payment to deliver world-class care for the next 100 years for children right across this country. It will be a revolution in children's healthcare. It is a shock to me, and perhaps speaks to our values, that during the entire Celtic Tiger there wasn't a children's hospital built.
Yeah.
And this
Fair
will, when
point.
it's open, make a real difference. And 2 out of the 3 parts of it are already open, treating sick children today in Tala and Connolly.
Quick further question on the Children's Hospital. With the benefit of hindsight, and I absolutely accept that it is only with the benefit of hindsight, would you have done a deal with BAM as the lead contractor to build the hospital?
So I think it's very dangerous, quite frankly, for a politician to ever speak about one particular company because of the independence of procurement. But
Hard not to in relation to this hospital, because they have been criticised by the people responsible for managing the building of the hospital.
So what I would say is 2 things. When I was the minister, I did bring in PwC. I asked them to look at the project and make recommendations. And in summary, they decided to stop it, change it, pause it. Would have cost more and delayed the hospital further. The second thing I'd make is this, and this is a point I feel very strongly on in this election: how we deliver major infrastructure projects in this country needs to change. This happens all too often. Lots goes well in this country, lots of projects come in under budget, on time, that's all true. In fact, the majority do. But when we get to major projects, mega projects, people across the country know it takes too long and costs too much. That's why I'm not just commenting on it in the election. Since I've become Taoiseach a few months ago, I've said I want to establish a Department of Infrastructure. The public service are great in this country, but we need to build up expertise in engineering,
Okay.
quantity surveying, project management. And if I lead the next government, that's exactly what we will do.
Two very quick things before we let you go. They're big subjects, but we'll try to get through them quickly. Fine Gael, in office, you have got a lot right in the last 14 years. I think it's important to acknowledge that, the economy and so on. But do you acknowledge you were far too slow as a party to realise the crisis in the housing sector?
I can't truthfully acknowledge that because we do absolutely realise the crisis in the
You
housing
do
sector.
now, but were you too slow in
No,
doing
we
so?
realised it from day one. I mean, since I've been sitting in my constituency office in Bray, meeting people in the darkest depths of the recession. But I would make this point: the housing crisis in some way has evolved. It's gone from a situation of ghost estates, mortgage arrears, people fear of losing the roof over their head, to a situation now about supply, and ramping up supply. And what I would say is this: when I was a TD in 2011, fewer than 7,000 homes built, heading towards 40,000 this year.
Okay.
We have a funded plan of €40 billion to get to 303,000 homes. And what we should not do in this election is allow any party pull the rug from under first-time buyers. And that's why we're committed to keeping the Help to Buy scheme, keeping the First Home scheme, and actually improving them and tweaking them, having listened to young people across the country.
I was reading your party manifesto last night. What do you mean by a firmer immigration policy?
Yeah, good question. I mean, what I mean is the rules have to be applied, and they have to be applied in a more efficient way. So if you have a right to be here, that is great. Immigration is a good thing. Have your right to be here, work, pay your way, and get on with it. If you don't have a right to be here, you need to leave more quickly. Deportations, we need to be able to show the people that they do take place. Voluntary deportation is always the most effective way, but we also need to be able to show people that if voluntary doesn't work, there are mandatory deportations. Introducing a contribution model. Like, Irish people want two things when it comes to migration, I believe: compassion and common sense. We're decent people. We shouldn't shut down people for raising issues about migration. There's far too much of an attempt to dismiss the concerns communities have. What they also want to know, though, is that there is that common sense that if you're living here in international protection and working and earning an income, that you're being asked to pay a contribution. What I mean by firmer is that we work at a European level. There's only 5.3 million of us in this jurisdiction. We need to work at an EU level on things like how we return people to countries if they don't have that right to be here. So we're setting up in real time. This is the first general election where migration has really even been discussed as an issue. Since I've become Taoiseach, I've taken a very active interest in this. I hope and think people have seen some progress in terms of our policy approach. And what I'm very clearly saying is the rules will be applied without fear or favour. They'll be tightened up where appropriate, and we'll work at a European level in relation to migration too.
Final question, Taoiseach. You've been traversing the country at some speed, and I think you visited probably every constituency. Well, you definitely have visited every constituency in the country
Yes.
at this stage, probably many times. And the campaign is very focused on you, but your parliamentary party has lost 18 of its TDs, over half its TDs, hundreds of cumulative years of Leinster House know-how and nous. You have a big inexperience problem, don't you? There's a lack of grey hair among your senior figures. There's a lack of experience.
Well, I'm quickly making up on the grey hair stakes with the stress of this job. But no, you know what? I took over this party to regenerate it and to rejuvenate it. I didn't sign up to just continue as was. I signed up to reconnect, renew, and energise our party from a policy point of view on lots of issues. You are right. We've had many retirements, but you know what else we have? Lots of new candidates coming up in their community. And while they are new to Leinster House, how long you've sat in a leather seat in Leinster House is not the only experience. People who've ran farms, ran businesses, worked as SNAs, Gardaí, served overseas in the Defence Forces, represented their county on the sports field. I'm energised and enthused by the calibre of candidates we have. And I want to lead our country as Taoiseach. I've only had an opportunity to do it for 7 months. And I'm asking people to vote for my team in the 43 constituencies so that I can continue that job and so my party can play a positive role in leading a centrist government that can steer our country through the next 5 years.